We have come to worship in this holy space together, to chase out evil thoughts for good, to share a vision of a world of happiness and peace, to understand the need for toleration, love, and respect, to reaffirm our common humanity.
The chalice will now be lit in Kathy Williams' house. Our reading for today is entitled Hosea Ballew's Conversion, and it comes from our very own Tapestry of Faith by the UUA, which is available online. In 1789, Hosea Ballew attended the Baptist revival held in his hometown of Richmond, New Hampshire. Moved by the preaching during this event, which was touted as the Great Reformation, Ballew, aged 19, stepped forward to be baptized. Like his friends and the 100 or so others around him who also stepped forward to be saved, Ballew had been gripped by fear. But unlike the others professing their new, aching need for God's forgiveness and grace, Ballew was not fearful enough. He did not feel what he was supposed to feel, namely, gut-wrenching fear. He believed the dominant Calvinist theology of his era, which claimed God separated the elect from the damned before they were born, and that except for those chosen few, all were doomed to eternal damnation, fire and brimstone for all their sins. Yet he did not feel clenched in the grip of an angry, vengeful, wrath-filled God described by the two preachers who led the revival. Ballew was upset because he wasn't upset enough. People were supposed to be terrified of this God and fearful that they might not be one of his chosen people. Ballew described his predicament years later in a letter to a friend. I was much troubled in my mind because I thought I did not stand in such fear of the divine wrath as I ought to, or as others have done before they found acceptance with God. Worse yet, the doctrines he was now supposed to believe about God and Christ rung hollow. To figure out what was going on, Ballew turned to the Bible to make sense of the doctrines of his newly professed faith. His mind became troubled anew. It seemed to him that nothing in the Bible supported belief in the Baptist doctrines he was supposed to espouse. Belief in eternal damnation for all human beings, except a preordained elect few. Belief in the sacrifice of Christ to reconcile an aggrieved God to sinful man. Belief that Christ was the Son of God was also at the same time his own Father. Ballew's keenly rational mind rejected such notions as illogical and thus patently absurd. The Bible seemed to affirm universalism, universal salvation for all, and Unitarianism, the unity of the Godhead, rather than in a triune God as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. With these discoveries, Ballew felt happy. Happiness abounded in his heart, and he now knew why he had not felt fearful enough. There was nothing to fear. The God of wrath preached by angry ministers was a human-made God, a false God. By removing the false teachings and the errant theology, Ballew felt the God of love. Ballew felt loved and he was happy. But when Ballew tried to explain to the local ministers what he felt and what he had discovered, they screamed at him about his burgeoning universalist faith, rather than reason with him over the interpretation of biblical texts. So Ballew's universalism and Unitarianism took firmer hold of his heart and his mind, and his new liberal faith now flowed forth from happiness. He believed that all human beings would be blessed in their afterlife. God condemns no one to eternal punishment and damnation. Universal salvation, Ballew discovered, is a grace-filled gift of an eternally loving God for humanity. Ballew finally believed that our personal desires motivate our actions And all of them, benevolence, greed, self sacrifice, love, etc., boil down to just one: the personal desire to feel internally happy.
Well, it is good to be back among you in my virtual pulpit. And what a Sunday to return, Valentine's Day. I love it when Valentine's Day falls on a Sunday because it's one of those kind of sneaky holidays that's wormed its way into our secular culture. And while some cynics claim it's a holiday invented by a complex cabal of the flower, chocolate, and greeting card industries, we know better. This is Valentine's Day because it is the feast of Saint Valentine, who was martyred in Rome on this day in 269 AD. Valentine's Day is a religious holiday, a saint's feast to be exact, which in our modern parlance went viral. So, what do we know about St. Valentine? Well, during Valentine's time, it was expected that young men, when they were old enough and strong enough, would join the military, the Roman legions. And while we're accustomed in this country to having military service be voluntary, it is not in some countries, and it certainly was not back then. Some young men did what many have done after them when faced with an unwanted conscription into the military. They looked for a way out of it. And apparently, there was something of a loophole. Married men could not get drafted. They were starting families and carrying on the work of the empire. And as one can imagine, this led to a rash of marriages to try and get out of being in the army. And as one can further imagine, the counter response was to close that loophole. And so the Romans did a shockingly odd thing. They outlawed marriage, cracked down on who and how often someone could get married. And the church did not take kindly to this. While it would take another 1,200 years to make it official, eventually the church would go so far as to declare marriage a sacrament. But in the meantime, guys like Valentine decided to flaunt the unchristian, anti-love position and start performing weddings for couples who were in love. Eventually, he was caught and killed by the Romans on February 14th. In a way that should not surprise us, love has always been political. It certainly was in St. Valentine's era, and it most assuredly is in ours. A number of years ago, when I was serving as minister in Wilmington, Delaware, Delaware became an early state to legalize same-sex weddings. This was 4 years or so before the Supreme Court made it legal everywhere. Well, Wilmington is I guess you'd call it a border town between Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey. That meant that people came over from Pennsylvania. When they did so, one of the first churches they would see was the Unitarian Church. There was a few months where it felt like I was just a couple of slot machines and a blackjack table away from being Las Vegas. We were marrying everybody. Whom we love and how we love is a political act. It could be other things too, of course, but love has a political dimension to it, no doubt about it. Perhaps there was no greater prophet of love in this country than Hosea Ballou, whom we heard about in our reading this morning. Hosea Ballou was a minister, a kind of folksy, down-home theologian, and an evangelist for universalism. His book, The Treatise on Atonement, is perhaps the most eloquent argument for universal salvation in the Christian religion that maybe has ever been written. As we heard in our reading, Ballou was arguing against a God of fear, which was an image that was quite popular in his time. This was a position that said that God is angry with humanity because of Adam's original sin, which had been carried on to us today. God demands that the score be settled, and Jesus' death overcomes this deficit. And while I really don't want to veer off into vicarious atonement too much this morning, suffice it to say that this is a God who's, I don't know, kind of like a Southern gentleman who's been wronged and challenges us to a duel. He's mad and demands satisfaction. Well, Ballou thought that this made no sense, particularly in light of Jesus's teachings. Ballou liked to talk more about what Jesus taught than how he died and supposedly came back to life. Because Jesus's teachings are mostly about love, how we can and indeed should if we're truly to be his followers, called to love as widely and as deeply as possible. For Jesus, that included saints, sinners, fishermen, prostitutes, lepers, tax collectors, and even one of the thieves that died next to him on the cross. God's love for us is infinite. God's forgiveness is infinite. God's mercy is infinite. No matter how much we humans have messed up and sinned, we can only do so much. Our sins are always finite compared to God's infinite love. And thus, everyone is going to heaven because it is impossible to be outside of the love of God. You may think you are, you may not feel it every day, but you're always a beloved child of God, Luke teaches us. And therefore, we should do good works out of gratitude as an expression of love, as an act of love for others as God works through us. That, my friends, is the good news of universalism. It is a message that is not perfect in all cases, but it is a powerful corrective on modern religion, which seems literally hell bent on separating, demonizing, and persecuting people who are other than themselves. We need a resurgence and a renewal of that unconditional, universal love for all people without exception. The mission of the Unitarian Universalist congregation of the Hudson Valley is summed up in 4 words: seek, connect, act, and love. All 4 of those words are worthy of their own sermon and extended reflection throughout our faith journey as a congregation. However, today, since it is Valentine's Day, I'll stay with love as one of our core values. In fact, it's in no small part the credit to Universalists like Hosea Ballou that love is so ingrained into our DNA as a key part of our religious identity. I see it around here all the time. Sharing and caring committee who not only give people rides and food, but also knit shawls for folks who are experiencing a loss so that they can physically feel the warmth of their church community around their shoulders as they grieve. I see it in our RE volunteers who teach what we're calling owl that isn't owl. Being in a virtual space, they can't do all of the activities of the Our Whole Lives curriculum. So we can't officially call it Our Whole Lives. But yet our kids and the kids of some of the nearby congregations, they need OWL still. We still have to teach them about sexuality, relationships, how to make healthy choices. Our kids still have spiritual and emotional needs. And so we teach it even if there is one hand tied behind our backs at times. That's an act of love, if ever there was. And yes, we see love play out in social justice. Our Allies for Racial Equity group has been meeting weekly to discuss and educate themselves and others around white supremacy and anti-racism for nearly a year now. And while I don't go to every meeting, I have been often enough to see that people there do so out of love for all people, regardless of their background or racial identity. It is their love for justice that lifts up the names such as Breonna Taylor and George Floyd so that we never forget how they died. It is Hosea Ballou's universal love that is all embracing of new perspectives in our Unitarian Universalist faith. It is love that calls us to center the voices of people of color after having them on the margins for too long. Love values everyone. That's what Hosea Ballou was saying when you get right down to it. Everyone, without exception, even and especially when it's difficult to do so. Love never promised easy. Love is a difficult spiritual practice at times. No one knows this better than the folks at General Assembly in 2019. This was in Spokane, Washington, and the minister of the local UU church, the Reverend Todd Eckloff, spoke during one of the sessions. It's not uncommon for the minister of the host city to get a little airtime during GA. Anyway, while people were coming into this big hall, thousands of people, they were all handed a book called the Gadfly Papers, which Reverend Eckloff had written and self-published. It was a series of essays exonerating the move in recent years towards dismantling white supremacy and the UUA's strong emphasis on anti-racism. Needless to say, this upset a number of people. A petition among my colleagues circulated online to refute these statements that sought to roll back the work on anti-racism that had just begun. I'm proud to say that my name is among those who spoke out against this document. Though not everyone disagreed with Reverend Eckloff. Perhaps you were unaware of it, given it was a pretty rough year around here at the time, but the UUA had its own conflict brewing. Some ministers agreed with Eckloff. They felt that Unitarian Universalism had abandoned its identity as a faith of the free that allowed for freedom of expression and reasonable debate. And in some cases, I felt they had a point. Reason is an important value for us. Historically, the Unitarians have used reason as a source of religious authority and a way to understand their faith. It is not to be abandoned lightly, as the Gadfly ministers argued. Well, what followed was an ongoing argument among ministers and lay people about who we are as Unitarian Universalists. In many ways, this discussion kind of mirrored the broader culture, with the Gadfly's supporters as a form of Trumpism within our ranks. Not that they supported Trump politically, but that they mimicked some of the online behaviors of his followers. Now, I called it a discussion just now, but it got nasty. Todd Eckloff was eventually removed both from fellowship in the UUA and membership in the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association. Not because he had an idea that differed with someone else, but because he caused harm to his colleagues and would not participate in the process to heal that broken relationship. Apparently, there are some of his followers who are in a similar situation. A group of colleagues, some of whom were friends and mentors of mine, decided that that was it and resigned from the Unitarian Universalist ministry in protest. Now, a lot of this all happened when I was on sabbatical last year. And that means two things. One, I had a lot of time to think about the different angles of this controversy. And the other, I didn't have a congregation had to listen to my opinions on the subject. That is until this morning. So here's my take. The whole Gadfly thing was an example of what we like to call a values polarity, meaning we had two values that were in conflict with each other. In this case, reason and love, in the form of including people of color more fully in Unitarian Universalism. The conflict is over which value do we hold in higher regard, love or reason. Normally we can have both of them just fine, but this particular issue put them into conflict. I'll always have a sympathetic ear for those who argue for reason and tradition. As a UU minister, our history is sacred to me and holds many spiritual lessons. But in a little while, we'll sing a hymn that says that we are to revere the past, but trust the dawning future more. Unitarian Universalism is about moving into the future. We love our history and our tradition of reason, and it's going nowhere. But now is clearly the time to embrace a changing culture that sees and feels the need to center Black and brown voices in new ways. If you want a lesson in UU history, it's this. Whenever we've had the choice to be more inclusive or more exclusive, we've nearly always chosen inclusion, eventually. Sometimes it takes a little while for us to come around, but eventually we see that the future is love. And what better way to learn about the future, I say, than Star Trek? In the Star Trek Discovery video today, Michael Burnham says that our principles are what make us who we are, even in the face of our own survival. And that's why the Gadfly defenders and critics, both sides, fought so strongly. They knew that we are all in the process of redefining Unitarian Universalism, possibly for a generation to come. And we need to make love one of our core principles that define who we are, not just now, but for generations of Unitarian Universalists in the future. That's what our principles do for us. And as Michael Burnham says, it is all we have. And it's why we need to add an eighth principle that highlights and spotlights the need to do anti-racism work and fight white supremacy in all of its forms, even and especially when it is within us. We need a statement like that for ourselves when we inevitably forget, and for others who are inquiring about who we are. Those principles are that statement that help define us, and anti-racism needs to be forefront among them. Now, I understand that it can be scary to let go of the Unitarian Universalism we once knew, to embrace the dawning future of a Unitarian Universalism that includes new voices and perspectives. Todd Eckloff and other Gadfly ministers could not, in the words of this morning's meditation, be curious enough about this moment and savor what they dread. But as Hosea Ballou taught us, we must let go of a vision of fear and embrace a vision of love. Just as he warned against that angry God that punishes and demands retribution, Ballou knew that the future was love. Saint Valentine himself lived according to his principles. He and Michael Burnham would have been two peas in a pod. Valentine taught love and lived according to love because it was one of his core principles. He knew that love is the future. He was willing to die for it. The future is love. Let us collectively embrace that future, even if it means savoring what we dread. Because I believe that the future is bright if we are living out our church's mission. May we understand that love is political, love is a spiritual practice, love is our history, and love is our future. May we meet it with courage and hope. And most of all, I love all of you. Go in peace. Amen.
Now join me again in our chalice extinguishing words. The words are in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
In our hour together, we have known once again our beloved community. We have lifted our hearts and souls in songs of celebration. We have nurtured our spirits in this community of sacred concern. Take with you now the warmth of this community. Take with you now the song in your heart and soul, that we might nurture and sustain you until we are together again.